What's up everybody, welcome back to Krebsbach Racing and part 2 of the 135i drift build.
To pick up where we left off, next we need to mount the handbrake.
I do have some spare panels laying around. This is from when I was testing out materials for splitters. I have a couple different spare panels and we decided to use that for the mounting point for the handbrake. I had originally bought a Seems Legit Racing bracket and handbrake, and that moved the bracket or the handbrake all the way over here. And it's fine if it's a street car. I think it's kind of out of the way. It's out of the way of your gauges and everything. But this is going to be a competition car, so I wanted my handbrake nice and close, right off the steering wheel, kind of in between there and the shifter, so everything's right there. I don't have to think about it. It's easy to grab. So I ended up sending back the bracket. Nothing wrong with it, just not really great for a competition format. And this is what we came up with for the handbrake. You just have a piece of carbon fiber here that I templated out, cuts around the shifter. And then I did a reverse handbrake here. So it's pulls from here. It's just a little bit off of the dash, barely touches it. And then we'll be able to pull straight back on that. Ended up turning out pretty nice. The carbon fiber looks nice. And then it goes right back where the old e-brake lines went through. And we just used some rubber hose there so nothing catches on anything. And then a clamp to hold it there in place. As it's right above the drive shaft, it's kind of tough, so you gotta keep it tight. Next up on the list of things to do is we need to get an oil pan baffle in there. I'm always worried about oil starvation. So I went to my friends at Bimmerworld and they sent me a new gasket for our oil pan and then an oil pan baffle that needs to go in the oil pan. So we need to drop everything, drop the subframe and get that in the car. You need to make sure you support the engine. I got this brace off of Harbor Freight and all you need is a tow hook. This is the stock tow hook. Threads into the top of the motor there. Just tighten that down, that'll hold your engine while you take the subframe off.
The first thing you want to do is support the subframe with the jack, and then we can work on the subframe bolts. There are 6 of them, 4 that go straight up and then 2 towards the back of the car that are at a little bit of an angle.
Hey, the engine's staying there, that's good.
Now you can lower the subframe just a little bit, but you need to loosen up and take off 3 bolts that are connected to the lower radiator line. They are ridiculously long, about 2 inches, to hold a little plastic clip. But they still need to come out before you lower the subframe anymore. You also need to disconnect the steering column from the steering rack on the back of the rack. The steering rack comes down with the subframe, so you need to get that out before you can lower the subframe. Now I didn't notice beforehand, but the power steering pump is actually bolted to the front of the oil pan, so you need to remove the serpentine belt up top before you lift the car up in the air. And then you can take these 3 bolts off to get the power steering pump off. And then we can get to work on the 75 oil pan bolts.
Yeah, I need some lube on that. Trying to get on the camera. I'll send you that.
A little trick to clean the oil pan is to use a little bit of diesel fuel. Pour some of that in there and that'll help get rid of the initial oil. After that I'll use a bunch of Dawn dish soap and a scrub brush and just keep scrubbing until I get everything off. We'll get that oil pan gasket off there and clean everything as good as we can.
Alright, so this is our little baffle made out of aluminum. These little trap doors are stainless steel. They're going to help keep oil right around the pickup. So we just need to set this in here. It's got a nice tight fit. And then we need to weld right around the edges a little bit, a couple tacks to get it to stay in there. And this is aluminum, and I'm a little bit nervous because I am not an aluminum welder. Not very good at TIG, so we'll see how this goes.
Now I honestly have less than an hour worth of TIG welding done in my life and hasn't been very successful, so I'm going to do a little practice here just to get used to it and see if we can get this thing welded up. I will start by saying this is a little bit of a difficult weld for a beginner. Welding about 7mm thick aluminum, which is the oil pan, to about 1.5mm thick, which is the oil baffle. Two very different thicknesses. It's tough to heat one up and get it to melt without melting the other one. So I had quite a bit of trouble getting the pool started. I was able to get the two pieces to melt together, but I was still having a lot of trouble.
Well guys, I did my best, but I had to call in reinforcements. I'm sure you can see the difference between the two welds here. My buddy Justin Fitment came in and had to bring it over to him and get this so it wouldn't crack and fall into my motor somehow. So these are looking a lot nicer. Some nice stacked dimes. It was really difficult, so I just had to call in a favor. Let's get this back in the car.
These are torque to yield bolts. They are aluminum. You only use them once, so I'm basically just tightening these down and getting them snug, and then you get them down to 8 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Next up on the fabrication list is a set of front and rear crash bars. Now I looked all over on the internet and I couldn't really find anything that I liked. There was only one company in the US that made some, and they didn't really cover or protect much of the car, I didn't think, so I decided to make my own. So I went and bought some steel, about $80 worth of metal, and we're going to try to build our own.
You get sparks inside my shoes and light my socks.
Stop wearing hey dudes to do your fabricating.
I decided to use 1/4" plate steel for the frame, and I'm using a 13 gauge 1 3/4" pipe for the stub, and then for the rest of the piping on the front bumper and rear bumper I'm going to use 14 gauge 1.5" tubing. Now I am about 100 times better at MIG welding than I am at TIG welding, and that's mainly because of the ESOB welder that I bought. It has a smart MIG control on it, and you basically just set the thickness of your metal and you can weld just about anything. You can set your heat range at, basically is what I call it. Either you want a thicker weld or a thinner weld, you want it to melt in more or you want it to build up a little bit more. It's just a dial on the welder. In this case I have the welder set to a little hot on the 1/8 inch thickness side, and then I'm just spending a little bit more time on the 1/4" plate than I am on the 13 gauge tube. Alright, let's take a deep breath and do something else we haven't done before. Borrowed this tubing bender from a buddy of mine, Jeff Hahn. Need to give him a big thanks. This is my first time trying this, and I basically just used a 1/4" steel rod and used that as a template against the front bumper. The front bumper was a little difficult as it's like one continuous curve, so it's hard to do, especially with your first time trying this stuff. So probably had 8 to 10 bends throughout this whole thing. Trying to keep everything level so I don't get a twist in the pipe, which is going to be, I don't know how you fix that, it's pretty much impossible, but we ended up doing alright. We got it pretty straight and it fit the car in the end. Onto the front lower bar. This one was a lot easier. I learned from my first one that only put a few bends in it, so I just have 2 bends on each side with a big straight part in the middle. The bumper was shaped a little bit different on the bottom, so this one went much smoother. And we didn't have to redo this one either. As you can see, I got the top bar all tacked up and everything's fitting well, slides in and out nice, nothing bent so far. Bumper seems to be fitting nice too. It's not pushing the bumper out and it's not too far away either. Just need to trim the sides to make the bumper fit a little better. I used a Diablo saw blade to cut these pipes. It worked well for a while and then it got dull pretty quick. I only probably got 20 cuts out of it, so I wouldn't recommend that. Maybe use a grinder or a bandsaw. Everything ended up fitting pretty good actually. Even my vertical bars were all the same length, which means both bars were parallel with each other. They didn't have a twist in them or anything, so that worked out well. Next, we'll get this thing finish welded. Make sure you move around the part so you don't warp anything too bad. Everything seemed to stay in place pretty good. I needed to weld on some tabs for my oil cooler. This was one of the main problems I had with the car. There's really no room up front for an oil cooler. Only a few inches away from the tire and I'm right up against the crash bar, but I was able to sneak one in there. Last but not least is a toe strap attachment. I just did a little 3/16 plate steel here into a triangle, and I'll drill a hole in the end of it. Now it's time for the rear bumper. We're basically going to do the same thing. We'll cut out our back plates to mount against the frame, drill them out, get them cut, and then I'll bend another 1/4 inch rod around the back bumper and see if we can get that to fit in. There's actually a nice little slot in the stock body that you can use, and I was able to get the bar nicely to sit in there. It's a little more difficult of a bend because we have to bend about 70 degrees on each side, which you can get it twisted pretty easily there. So this one was a little bit tougher, a little bit less forgiving, but we ended up getting it in the end. Alright, all the fabrication is finally done. Let's get these scuffed up, wipe them down, and then we'll get them painted. I'm going to be using the same paint that I used on the roll cage, that hammer tone from Rust-Oleum. Works really good. Again, just apply with the brush. Took maybe a half hour or something like that, not too long. Next up is to finish the lines for the oil cooler, and we run into another problem. I originally wanted to run the stock thermostat. I had a lower thermostat set in it and got this little adapter plate on the bottom with two -10s on the bottom. You can't get both of those to turn the same way. There's not enough room between the engine and the radiator fan. So I ended up ditching that and going with just a plate. We got rid of the thermostat so there won't be any regulation on it. It'll just be straight through the oil cooler all the time, but we do have a fan to help control heat a little bit. One trick to cutting AN lines is to wrap it very tightly in electrical tape and then cut it. That keeps all the stainless steel ends from fraying out, and it's easy to get your fitting on. I'm going to pre-fill the oil cooler and the lines. It's a lot of oil for the oil pump to pump without getting any oil to the bearings as we're turning it over. So make sure you do that. We'll get our lines installed and routed up to the thermostat. Sitting nicely underneath the headlight. And on top we have our fan switch. This is operated by temp. At 190 degrees it'll turn on the fan. Next we'll get this thing filled with oil. We'll put in a new oil filter. And last we need to bleed the coolant system. I put in a CSF radiator that I don't have on film, but this is how you refill the radiator. You need to put the key to the ignition and push the start button once. And we need to turn the fan on the lowest setting and the temperature all the way up. Next we push the accelerator all the way down for 10 seconds and you should hear the electric water pump kick on. Now you do need to open the bleed screw on the reservoir until it bleeds pressure and gets primed, then you can close it. Otherwise you'll get a nice little mess like this.
All right guys, that's gonna do it for the 135i drift build. Finished up the rear bumper, the front bumper, both crash bars. Got a lot of the fab work out of the way. I think most of that is pretty much done. The oil cooler, the handbrake, all of that was kind of custom stuff that took a lot of time. So next up in part 3, we're gonna take the car and put coilovers on it. We have some suspension coming from Fortune Auto. We'll get that on the car, we'll get it on the dyno, see how much power we're making, and then we'll go for a test drive. So stay tuned, like and subscribe for more content on Krebsbach Racing, and we'll see you guys in the next one.